The big auditorium was full of excited people. Cameras flashed as some of the most powerful and richest people in the world gathered for a huge event, the Global Tech and Business Summit. Billionaires, CEOs, and famous business leaders sat in the front row, shaking hands and smiling at each other. The room smelled like expensive perfume and fancy suits. But this event wasn't just a party. It was a place where powerful people showed off their success and proved they were the best. Everyone on stage had built a big business, making more money than most people could ever dream of. Journalists and business experts sat in the crowd, listening carefully to every word. Right in the middle of it all was Leo Jackson. He called himself the king of innovation. He was super rich, richer than some countries. He was known for creating big changes in industries, always staying in the news and loving attention. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a brand, a person everyone talked about. But tonight, something unexpected happened. A surprise guest had been added to the event, a name that no one expected to see on a stage full of billionaires. Keanu Reeves. Keanu wasn't there to talk about business, stocks, or technology. He was invited to speak about kindness and responsibility in technology, something very different from the usual talks about money and power. But the moment he walked on stage, dressed in his simple black suit, no tie, the whole room changed. People sat up straighter, whispering to each other, wondering why a Hollywood actor was sitting next to the richest men in the world. Leo Jackson, the billionaire, couldn't hide his amusement. He leaned forward, smirking as he spoke into the microphone. "Keanu Reeves," he said, making sure everyone could hear him. "I have to ask, what are you even doing here? This is a business summit, not a movie convention." Some people in the audience laughed. Some just smiled awkwardly. The cameras zoomed in on Jackson's face as he smirked. Keanu didn't get upset. He simply nodded, letting the laughter die down on its own. He stayed calm, his hands folded in his lap. Jackson, seeing that people were enjoying his joke, leaned back in his chair. He acted like he had already won. "Let's be real," Jackson continued, turning to the audience as if sharing a secret. "We're talking about the most powerful minds in business. People who built empires, created massive wealth, changed industries forever. And then we have you." Jackson waved a hand at Keanu. I love your movies. John Wick, great action. Very fun. But what can a guy who fights pretend bad guys in front of a green screen teach us about success?" The room got a little quieter. Fewer people were laughing now. Some of the journalists glanced at each other, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. They knew something big was about to happen. Keanu raised an eyebrow but still looked completely relaxed. Jackson grinned, feeling even more confident. "Come on, man," he said. "You can't seriously believe you belong here." Keanu tilted his head slightly, then repeated Jackson's words in a calm voice. "Out of place." He tapped his fingers against the table, thinking for a second. "Not really." Jackson laughed again, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. Be honest." Keanu turned and looked straight at Jackson, his face unreadable. Then in a steady voice he asked, "Tell me, Leo, when you walk down the street, when you go into a coffee shop, when you're around people who don't work for you, do they smile at you? Do they shake your hand? Do they tell you they respect you? Do you mean something to them?" For the first time, Jackson's smirk wavered. Just a little. It was small, but anyone paying close attention saw it. Keanu didn't stop. "Because that happens to me every day," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "Not because I have money. Not because I have power. But because of the way I treat people. Because of the way I make them feel." The room got so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "You measure success by how much money you have in the bank," Keanu said. "I measure it by how much I've given away. You talk about making money for future generations." Keanu paused, then said firmly, "I talk about making kindness last for future generations." His eyes locked onto Jackson's. "So tell me, Leo, when you're gone, what will people remember about you? The number in your bank account? Or the way you made them feel?" The room stayed silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Jackson's smirk had completely vanished. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Somewhere in the audience, a journalist's fingers flew across a keyboard. The story was already being written. Soon, the video clip would spread across the internet. The whole world would see what had just happened. And you, yes, you reading this right now. Have you ever met someone who thought their money made them better than everyone else? If you have, drop a 9 in the comments. Let's see how many of us have had to deal with people like that. Because this is just the beginning. Leo Jackson shifted in his seat. His confidence, his arrogance, it wasn't working anymore. The audience wasn't laughing with him. They were just watching. For the first time that night, Jackson looked uncomfortable. His fingers tapped against the table. His eyes darted around looking for someone to back him up. But no one did. They were all waiting, analyzing, watching. Keanu sat there completely calm, unaffected. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't playing Jackson's game at all. The difference between them was clear. One man desperate to prove he was better than everyone. The other, completely at peace with himself. Jackson cleared his throat and let out a forced chuckle. It sounded awkward. Too sharp. "That's cute," he said, waving a hand as if none of this mattered. "But let's be real. Kindness doesn't build billion-dollar businesses. Money does." Keanu tilted his head slightly as if thinking. Then he spoke. "Money can do a lot," he agreed. "It can buy influence. It can buy opportunities. It can buy the illusion of respect." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But it can't buy real connection. It can't buy peace of mind. And it sure as hell can't buy character." Jackson's smile twitched. He was getting irritated now. He wasn't used to being challenged in a way that money couldn't fix. Leaning forward, he lowered his voice, pretending to sound friendly. But there was still a sharp edge to it. "I get it now," he said, gesturing lazily. "You've built this whole nice guy image. The humble Hollywood outsider. People love it. They love the idea of a rich guy who still acts normal, who takes the subway, who gives away money. But let's not pretend you're different. You've made millions off your name just like us. The only difference? You pretend it doesn't matter." The crowd murmured. Some people shifted uncomfortably. The attempt to tear Keanu down was obvious. But once again, Keanu didn't take the bait. He let Jackson's words hang in the air for a long moment before answering. "I don't pretend money doesn't matter," he said softly. "I just don't let it define me." He met Jackson's gaze and asked one final question. "If you lost everything tomorrow, would you still be you?" The question hit hard. And this time, Leo Jackson had no answer. Jackson's mouth tightened into a thin line. For the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. The crowd could feel it. Something was changing. This wasn't just an argument between a famous actor and a rich businessman anymore. It was a fight about what really mattered in life. And everyone could see which side was winning. Jackson took a sharp breath and leaned back in his chair, shrugging like he didn't care. "You know what? This is pointless," he scoffed. "We live in the real world, Keanu. People don't get ahead by being nice. They get ahead by being smart, by taking chances, by making the hard choices." Keanu didn't argue. He just watched Jackson, quiet, as if letting him show who he really was without saying anything. Jackson let out a short laugh, but it didn't sound real. "Fine," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward the audience, showing a banking app. "This is how much money I have," he said proudly, holding up the number. It was a huge amount, so big that most people in the room couldn't even imagine having that much. "I'll donate all of this if you can prove that respect, kindness, and all those soft feelings you love actually get you further in life than money does." The crowd reacted with gasps and whispers. The challenge was crazy, but Jackson looked so sure of himself. He didn't think Keanu could win. Keanu glanced at the number on the phone, then looked back at Jackson. "That's a lot of money," he said quietly. "And yet, in this whole conversation, the only thing you've used to show your worth is a number on a screen." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "You don't have a single story about how you changed someone's life. Not one moment where you made someone's day better just by being there. All you have is a number. And the saddest part? That's all you think you are." Jackson's face darkened. His grip on his phone tightened. He had thought he would win this argument. He thought the crowd would cheer for his money and power. But now, looking around, he realized something scary. They weren't on his side anymore. Keanu sat up straight. "You want to know the difference between us, Leo?" he asked. "If you lost everything tomorrow, you'd just be another guy with nothing. But me? I'd still be Keanu Reeves." The words hit like a final punch. The room went silent for a moment. Then applause. Loud, strong, unstoppable. Jackson sat there, stiff, his jaw tight. The truth was sinking in. This wasn't just an argument anymore. It was something much bigger. His empire, his whole life, was built on power and fear. And now both were slipping away. Keanu didn't gloat. He just gave a small, knowing smile and leaned back in his chair, letting the noise of the room wash over him. He didn't need to prove anything. He never did. But for Leo Jackson, this was just the beginning of the fall. Jackson tried to stay calm, but anyone paying attention could see his anger. His fingers gripped his phone too tightly. His jaw was clenched. The applause still filled the huge room. The cameras were rolling, broadcasting everything live to millions of people. Social media was already buzzing with people posting clips and reactions. The hashtags were brutal. Hashtag Keanu destroys billionaire. Hashtag money can't buy respect. Hashtag humbled on Live TV. Jackson knew what was happening, but he refused to accept it. He forced out a laugh and shook his head, trying to act like it didn't bother him. "All right," he said, his voice smooth but sharp. "You got your little moment. Congratulations." He gestured to the audience, smirking. "But let's be honest. This is all for show, isn't it? A good Hollywood story. The big bad billionaire getting embarrassed by the wise actor." He glanced at the cameras as if reminding everyone that this was all just entertainment. "But when this is over," he continued, turning back to Keanu, "I'll still be running billion-dollar companies. I'll still be the one deciding the future of industries. I'll still be making a real impact in the world." He leaned in slightly, his voice quieter, almost like a challenge. "And you? You'll still just be a guy pretending to be other people." The words were meant to hurt. Jackson wanted to take back control, to remind everyone that money still mattered most. But Keanu didn't even flinch. He just looked at Jackson with a calm, almost amused expression, like he had seen this coming. Keanu let out a slow breath. Then he spoke, his voice so steady that the whole room leaned in to listen. "You know, Leo," he said, "I once heard someone say that if you're the richest person in the room, but no one respects you, then you're actually the poorest." The audience reacted immediately. Gasp. Whispers. Another shift in the air. Jackson's smirk twitched. Keanu continued, "I've played a lot of roles in my life. Heroes, villains, warriors, kings." He paused, his eyes steady. "But the best role, the one I don't have to act for, is just being a good person. And the best part? That's completely free." Silence. Then another shift. Jackson sat back, shaking his head, acting unimpressed. But his stiff shoulders gave him away. He was losing. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "You talk about making an impact," he said, "but tonight the only thing you've done is remind people why money isn't the same as worth." He gestured toward the crowd. "And I'm not the one saying it. They are." Jackson finally looked at the audience, and for the first time he really saw their faces. The same people who had laughed at his jokes earlier, the ones he thought were on his side, weren't laughing now. They weren't smiling. They were looking at him with something different. Disgust. And that was when Leo Jackson realized the real nightmare wasn't that he had lost an argument. It was that he had lost something much worse. The illusion that people admired him. The room was getting louder. People were checking their phones, whispering, shaking their heads. The cameras zoomed in, catching every reaction. In the control room, producers were already cutting clips, preparing headlines, seeing the story unfold in real time. Then, a voice from the crowd. Loud, clear, impossible to ignore. "If you're so powerful, why do you look so scared?" Laughter. But not the kind that made Jackson feel powerful. The kind that made him feel small. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. For the first time in his life, Leo Jackson, billionaire, business leader, untouchable mogul, was facing something he had never truly known before. Consequences. Keanu didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already won. And then, as if the universe wanted to make it even worse, one of the event's sponsors, the people who had proudly supported Jackson, stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked out. Then another. Then another. Jackson watched it happen in real time. And for the first time that night, his face turned pale. This wasn't just public embarrassment anymore. This was something much worse. Reputation. The one thing money couldn't instantly fix. The cameras kept rolling. The internet was on fire. His empire, his carefully built image, was slipping away. Not because he lost a debate, but because the world had finally seen him for who he really was. And Keanu? Keanu just sat back, calm, collected, watching it all unfold. Because he had nothing left to prove. But for Leo Jackson, the fall was only beginning. The tension in the room had reached its peak. The room that used to be full of people who admired Leo Jackson was now cold. The feeling had changed. People no longer looked at him like he was great. Instead, they looked at him with something even worse than anger, pity. Hatred meant he still had power. Pity meant he had lost it. Jackson adjusted his suit and forced a smile, pretending that everything was fine. But his fingers trembled as he gripped the table. He needed to fix this to remind everyone, remind himself, that he was still in charge. "All right," he said, letting out a sharp breath. He shook his head like this whole thing wasn't important. "Let's be honest. This was never a real debate. This was just a way to make people feel good on the internet. Congratulations, Keanu. You've won in the court of public opinion. His eyes darkened as he leaned into the microphone. But let's get one thing straight. When this is over, you'll go back to making movies. And I'll still be building the future. Jackson tightened his grip on the mic, holding onto it like it was his last chance. That's the difference between us, he continued, trying to sound confident. I create real change. I shape industries. I build companies that move the world forward. And you? You just act in front of a camera and call it art. He let out a small laugh. The only reason people love you so much is because you play characters they want to believe in. But in the real world, that kind of thinking doesn't matter. His words should have been strong. They should have won the room back. But instead, they did the one thing Jackson feared most. They showed everyone how desperate he really was. Keanu didn't answer right away. He just looked at Jackson, quiet and calm. The crowd was waiting. The silence stretched longer and longer. Then, finally, Keanu spoke. His voice was quiet but steady, and it carried more weight than any angry argument ever could. You talk about shaping the future, Keanu said, staring straight at Jackson. But the future isn't just numbers on a balance sheet. It's people. And if you think money alone is enough to shape the world, then you don't understand it at all. Jackson opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but Keanu wasn't done. You say I play characters people want to believe in, Keanu continued. Maybe that's true. But have you ever stopped to wonder why? Jackson hesitated. The question caught him off guard. It's because people see something in those characters that they need, Keanu said, his voice firm. Honor, integrity, decency. Not because those things aren't real, but because the world is full of people like you trying to convince them they don't matter. The words hit hard. Jackson felt it, and so did the crowd. The murmurs grew louder. People weren't just whispering anymore, they were openly talking. Then the moment that sealed Jackson's fate happened. A man sitting on the panel, a powerful businessman who had stayed quiet this whole time, slowly reached for his microphone. He was respected. His opinion mattered. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and spoke. I have to say, Leo, the man began, carefully choosing his words. I've been in business for decades. I've built companies, made deals, taken risks that paid off and some that didn't. He paused, glancing at Keanu before turning back to Jackson. But I've never seen a man destroy his own credibility this badly in a single night. The room exploded. Some gasped. Some clapped. A few even laughed. The words weren't shouted in anger. They weren't insults. They were worse. They spoke with disappointment. Jackson felt his face go hot. He opened his mouth trying to find something, anything, to say. But there was nothing. And then the final blow. One of Jackson's biggest investors, a man whose company had given billions to Jackson's businesses, stood up. Without a word, he buttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the exit. Within seconds, others followed. Executives. Business leaders. People who had once listened to Jackson's every word. And Jackson knew what that meant. It wasn't just the audience turning against him. It was the people who actually mattered. The ones who controlled the deals. The money. Keanu hadn't just embarrassed him. Keanu had cost him. Jackson's grip on the microphone tightened. His knuckles turned white. He sat there, stiff as a statue, watching his influence slip away. This was supposed to be his night. His moment. Instead, it was his downfall. Keanu didn't look pleased. He didn't gloat or smile. He just sat there, calm, watching Jackson come to terms with what had happened. Jackson swallowed hard, forcing a smirk. He leaned slightly toward Keanu and muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Keanu tilted his head slightly, unreadable. "Maybe not," he said simply. "But tonight it is." And with that, it was done. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Jackson's silent defeat. The internet would take it from there. Jackson still had his wealth, his companies, his assets. But in the world that truly mattered, the one where respect meant more than money, he had lost everything. And for the first time in his life, Leo Jackson had no way to buy it back. The room had changed. It wasn't just the whispers or the way people avoided his gaze. It was something deeper, something permanent. Jackson sat there, stiff and tight-jawed, feeling the weight of it all. He had lost the crowd, lost the room, lost the perfect image he had spent years building. And worst of all, he had lost to Keanu Reeves. Not because of money, not because of power, because of something much simpler. Character. Keanu had won, not by yelling, not by insulting, not by showing off his success. He had just been himself, and that had been enough. Jackson clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to win. That's what he always did. but the cameras were still on him. And he already knew what the headlines would say. Leo Jackson's worst public meltdown, humiliated on live TV. Keanu Reeves versus billionaire, when kindness exposes arrogance. How to lose respect, influence, and a room full of powerful people in under an hour. And then, the worst one of all. When money couldn't buy respect. Jackson's mind raced. He needed to take back control. Fast. Then, an opportunity. The moderator, a nervous man in a navy blue suit, cleared his throat, trying to regain order. "All right," he said, forcing a smile. "That was an engaging discussion. Let's take some audience questions before we wrap up." Jackson straightened. This was his chance. The moderator nodded at a young woman in the front row. She stood and spoke into the microphone. "My question is for Keanu," she said. "You've had a very successful career, but you're known for living simply and giving away so much of your wealth. Why?" Keanu smiled softly as if the answer was obvious. "Because money doesn't change who you are," he said. "It just makes you more of what you already are." The audience nodded, murmuring in agreement. But Jackson barely heard it. This was his moment. Before the moderator could move on, he leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth but sharp. "That's a nice thought, Keanu," he said, forcing a smirk. "But let's be real. If you lost everything tomorrow, how long do you think your kindness would last?" The crowd stilled. All eyes turned to Keanu. Jackson felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had him. Keanu took a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've already lost everything before," he said simply. Silence. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind that meant something real had just been said. Keanu didn't look away. "I lost my best friend when I was 23, he said. "I lost the woman I loved. I lost a child before I ever got to meet them. And you know what? None of it had anything to do with money." Jackson felt his throat go dry. Keanu's voice was steady. "I know what it's like to wake up and realize that everything you thought made you is gone," he said. "And when that happens, you learn real fast what actually matters." Jackson had no comeback. And the room knew it. Jackson's face showed no emotion. "So, if I lost everything tomorrow?" He shrugged. "I'd still be me." Jackson had no words. For the first time in his life, he truly had nothing to say. Because how could he argue with that? How could he win against someone who had already lost more than he could even imagine, and still came out strong? The audience wasn't just impressed anymore. They weren't just entertained. They were moved. Jackson knew then that he had lost. Not just the argument. Not just the audience. He had lost himself. And the worst part? He had done it live in front of millions of people. The moderator, realizing how serious the moment had become, quickly moved on to another question. But it didn't matter. The event was over, at least for Jackson. Because at that moment he wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was just a man with nothing real to offer. And no amount of money in the world could fix that. Leo Jackson sat there, completely still. His mind raced, desperately trying to find something, anything, to save his image. But there was nothing. No clever comeback, no joke, no way to show off his money or power that could undo what had just happened. The audience had seen it. They had felt it. And worst of all, they had chosen. Not him. Not the billionaire with endless money. But Keanu Reeves. A man who had just proven that even with nothing, he was still worth more than everything Jackson had. The event kept going. The moderator called on another panelist, trying to move things forward. But it didn't matter. No one was really paying attention anymore. Not to the next speaker. Not to Jackson. They were thinking about what they had just witnessed. Because everyone in that room, everyone watching on their screens, knew that they had just seen something unforgettable. Leo Jackson had fallen. Not in a big dramatic way. Not in a way that could be explained away as a mistake. No, he had fallen slowly, crushed under the weight of his own pride. His own blindness to the truth. Power without respect is just noise. Jackson took a deep breath through his nose, trying to stay calm. He could feel the camera still on him, capturing every tiny sign of stress, the tightening of his jaw, the way he shifted in his seat. Then something happened that he didn't expect. The whispers. Not from the audience. Not from the media. From his own people. His team. His investors. His business partners. The ones who had always followed him, always trusted him, were now looking at him differently. They weren't seeing a leader anymore. They were studying him. Weighing their options. Because people like them didn't follow people. They followed power. And tonight they were watching him lose it. Jackson clenched his jaw so tightly that his teeth hurt. No. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not here. Not now. Forcing himself to breathe, he glanced at his watch. The event was almost over. Just a few more minutes. He just had to hold on long enough to leave the room, get away from the cameras. Then he could fix this. But fate had other plans. The moderator, clearly aware of how big this moment was, smiled tightly. "Before we wrap up," he said, "we have time for one final question." Jackson nearly groaned. A hand went up near the back of the room. A microphone was passed to a young man, maybe in his early 20s, dressed neatly. A student or maybe a young businessman. His voice was steady. "My question is for Mr. Jackson." Jackson forced his face to stay calm. He wanted to be anywhere else. "Go ahead," he said carefully. The young man hesitated for a second. Then he spoke. "You've talked a lot tonight about money, about success, about power," he said. He glanced at Keanu for a brief moment before turning back to Jackson. "But my question is, what do you actually stand for?" The room went silent. Not a single sound. Not even a cough. Just complete stillness. Jackson blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. It was a simple question. It should have been an easy question. He had answered versions of it before, many times. To reporters. To students. To other business leaders. But never here. Never now. Not after the whole world had just seen him stripped of the one thing he had always counted on. His power. His fingers tapped against the table, a nervous habit. His mind raced, searching for the perfect answer, something smooth and polished. But nothing came. Because in that moment, the truth hit him like a truck. He didn't stand for anything. He had built companies, made billions, gained power. But for what? What legacy? What impact? What is the meaning? The longer the silence stretched, the more the audience's eyes sharpened. They were realizing something. Leo Jackson wasn't a visionary. He wasn't a leader. He was just rich. And that wasn't enough. Jackson swallowed hard. His voice cracked. He coughed, trying to steady himself. "I believe in innovation," he said finally, forcing confidence into his tone. "In progress. But it was too late." The young man simply nodded, as if he already had his answer. He handed back the microphone and sat down. Keanu, still silent, still calm, watched Jackson with that same unreadable expression. He didn't need to say anything. Jackson had destroyed himself. The moderator, sensing how awkward things had become, quickly stepped in. "All right, let's give a round of applause to our panelists." The claps were scattered. Polite. But they weren't for Jackson. Jackson didn't wait. He didn't say goodbye. He stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked off stage. No final remark. No last word. Just gone. And just like that, Leo Jackson, the billionaire who once controlled every room he entered, became nothing more than a cautionary tale. Keanu, still seated, exhaled slowly. His expression is unreadable. The cameras kept rolling. He didn't need to destroy Jackson. The billionaire had done that all by himself. Keanu took a deep breath as the big event finally ended. He looked around at the stage, the cameras, and all the excitement. Then he said, "At the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is how you make people feel. That's your real legacy." He leaned back in his chair, finished speaking. At first, no one moved. Then the crowd clapped, louder this time. It wasn't just polite applause anymore. It was real. They truly admired him now. But Keanu didn't try to enjoy the moment too much. He just gave a small smile and stood up from his seat. As he stepped off the stage, a rich, well-dressed man, one of the event's big sponsors, came up to him. "That was amazing," the man said, shaking Keanu's hand. "I've been to many of these events, but I've never seen anything like that." Keanu chuckled softly. "I wasn't trying to make a big moment," he said. "I just spoke the truth." The man smiled. And that's exactly why it worked. As Keanu walked toward the exit, more and more people came up to him. Businessmen, investors, people from the audience. They wanted to shake his hand, thank him, or just be near him. He had reminded them of something they had forgotten. Kindness and honesty still mattered. When Keanu finally stepped outside into the cool night air, his phone started buzzing nonstop. The world was already talking about what had just happened. News websites, social media, and online forums were flooded with videos, memes, and headlines. Keanu Reeves shuts down billionaire Leo Jackson in the most humble way possible. Keanu versus Jackson. A lesson in respect that money can't buy. What happened at the Global Tech Summit? The internet reacts. One video was going viral, a close-up of Leo Jackson, standing speechless after Keanu's final words. The caption read, "When your entire worldview gets shattered in real time." Keanu sighed, shaking his head. He had never wanted to embarrass anyone. But it had happened anyway, not because he was rude or mean but because the truth was too heavy to ignore. Meanwhile, Leo Jackson stormed into his giant, fancy penthouse. He threw his suit jacket onto a chair and marched to the huge glass windows that showed the entire city. Usually he loved looking at his empire, the bright lights, the tall buildings, the proof of his success. But tonight, for the first time, it all felt empty. His phone kept buzzing with notifications, calls, messages from his company, his PR team, and his investors. He finally checked one of the texts. PR Director. Leo, there's no way to fix this. The story is out of our hands. We need to prepare for the worst. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a disaster. And it was only the beginning. He turned from the window and walked over to his desk. He had to find a way to take back control. But how do you fix something that's already out of control? He opened his laptop and checked the news. The headlines were worse than he expected. Leo Jackson, a billionaire's ego meets reality and loses. Keanu Reeves' words destroy a billionaire's influence in one night. Jackson's empire shakes as stock prices crash. That last one made his stomach twist. He clicked on it. His company's stock had dropped by 15% in just 4 hours. That wasn't a small dip. That was a sign. A big, flashing warning sign that people were losing trust in him. Investors weren't just worried. They were pulling out. Then an urgent email popped up. From CFO. Subject: Emergency Board Meeting, 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Jackson clenched his jaw. His board of directors wasn't waiting. They weren't giving him time to spin this in his favor. They were already moving against him. His eyes darted to the live chat feeds on social media. The comments were endless. Jackson got destroyed. This isn't just bad PR. This is the end. He should just disappear for a while, maybe forever. Money can't buy class. Keanu proved that tonight. Jackson breathed deeply, trying to stay calm. This was fixable. It had to be. Then another headline caught his eye. Major sponsors cut ties with Jackson after the Global Tech Summit disaster. His vision blurred. He clicked on the article. It had begun. One by one, big companies were abandoning him. Some were making excuses, saying they were reassessing partnerships. But he knew the truth. This wasn't business. This was a cleansing. And that's when he finally understood. This wasn't just a bad speech. This was the beginning of the end. Keanu sat quietly in the back of a black SUV, looking out at the city lights as they passed by. He had learned long ago to let the world move on without trying to control it. His phone buzzed. A message from an old friend. You just made history tonight. Keanu sighed, shaking his head. He hadn't tried to make history. He hadn't tried to take down a billionaire. He had simply spoken the truth, and the world had listened. His driver glanced at him in the mirror. That was a crazy night, huh? Keanu smirked slightly. Yeah, he said, leaning his head back. Hell of a night. Outside, the city kept moving. But behind him, Leo Jackson's world was going up in flames. Back in his penthouse, Leo Jackson's phone buzzed again. A direct message from one of his top investors. Leo, we need to talk first thing in the morning. Be prepared for some hard decisions. Jackson swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. The board wasn't just calling for damage control. They were calling for his resignation. His hands trembled as he set the phone down. In just one night, he had gone from being one of the most powerful billionaires in the world, untouchable, unstoppable, to completely replaceable. And the worst part? Keanu Reeves hadn't done this to him. He had done it to himself. By now, the internet was having a field day. Memes, jokes, and videos of his downfall were everywhere. This is what happens when you think money makes you invincible. Keanu didn't just beat Jackson. He buried him with kindness. What's next for Jackson? Selling an apology NFT? People weren't just laughing at him. They were moving on without him. As the sun rose over the city, Leo Jackson sat alone in his penthouse office. His once pristine desk was now a mess. Half-empty glasses, crumpled papers, and a tablet showing his company's falling stock prices. The emergency meeting had already happened. The board had already made their choice. Leo, this isn't personal. We can't afford this kind of damage. That's what they told him. But he knew the truth. They weren't just cutting him out. They were erasing him. While Jackson's empire crumbled, Keanu Reeves moved forward. Because in the end, power and money fade. But kindness and truth last forever. Keanu Reeves was sitting alone in a small cafe in downtown Los Angeles, drinking a simple black coffee. There were no cameras, no fancy suits, just Keanu sitting quietly at a corner table reading a book. His phone buzzed with messages and news updates. Millions of people were talking about what had happened, but Keanu didn't check. He just turned his phone over and ignored it. This had never been about him. He hadn't wanted to embarrass Leo Jackson. He hadn't wanted to win anything. He had only told the truth, and now the whole world was reacting to it in their own way. As he took another sip of coffee, a young woman walked up to his table. She looked a little nervous, but after a moment she spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves?" Keanu looked up and gave her a friendly smile. "Yeah." She fidgeted with her phone, trying to find the right words. I just wanted to say thank you for what you said last night." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Oh." She nodded, gaining a little confidence. "It reminded me that success isn't just about money. It's about the kind of person you are when no one is watching. I think a lot of people needed to hear that." "I know I did." Keanu set his coffee down and really looked at her, not as a fan, not as a stranger, but as a person. "Then that makes it worth it," he said simply. The young woman smiled, nodded, and walked away. And just like that, Keanu knew he had done something more important than winning a debate. He had started a conversation. He had started a movement. In a tall, fancy apartment, Leo Jackson closed his laptop, shutting out the noise. His whole life he had tried to make people fear him, admire him, respect him. But now, as he sat alone in the mess he had created, he realized something. What he had truly wanted, what he had always needed, was something he had never earned. Respect. And now it was too late. The world had already moved on. Keanu Reeves had walked away from the big business meeting with his honesty and dignity. Leo Jackson had walked away with nothing. Now the question is for you. Do you think Leo Jackson got what he deserved? Did Keanu prove that kindness, honesty, and respect are more valuable than money and power? If you believe that respect is something you have to earn, not something you can buy, say yes in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to follow the channel. Because at the end of the day, the real question isn't about who has the most money. It's about the kind of person you choose to be when the world is watching. The world had already moved on. Leo Jackson, a man who once made people afraid and impressed at the same time, had now become a warning story. The news was changing. Instead of just talking about his downfall, people were asking bigger questions. Jackson's resignation. A shift in how big companies work. What Keanu Reeves had shown the world about power and respect. People were wondering, was this the end of billionaires who thought they could do whatever they wanted? This wasn't just about Leo Jackson anymore. For years, powerful people had believed that money was everything, that it could solve any problem. But what had happened at the Global Tech Summit had proved them wrong in front of millions of people. And now the world was paying attention. The next morning, Leo Jackson sat in a large, fancy meeting room, the same one he had designed to make everyone feel small around him. But today he was the one who felt small. Across the table sat the board of directors, the important people who had once followed his every decision, the people who had gotten rich because of him, the people who had never questioned him before. But today their faces were cold and serious. It was clear they had already made up their minds. "Leo," the chairman of the board said in a calm voice, "we appreciate everything you've done for this company. But after last night, we think it's best if you leave completely." Jackson sat up straighter. "I already agreed to quit as CEO," he said quickly. "That was the deal." The chairman nodded but didn't change his expression. "That was the first step. But investors are worried. Stockholders want to cut all ties with you. That means you have to sell your shares. You have to leave everything." Jackson's eyes widened. "You want me to walk away from my own company?" The CFO, a man who had once been his most loyal supporter, leaned forward. "Leo," he said, "you're the problem now. The longer your name is connected to this company, the more damage we take." Jackson's heart pounded. This wasn't just about stepping down. They were erasing him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, it was all being taken away. "I built this company," he whispered. "And now," the chairman replied, "you're the reason it's falling apart." A long silence filled the room. For the first time in his life, Jackson had no power, no way to escape. He had always believed money was the strongest weapon. But now he saw the truth. Money without respect was weak. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the pen. He could fight this, take it to court, make it last for years. But it wouldn't matter. His name was poison now. Finally, he signed the papers. And just like that, Leo Jackson was no longer a billionaire. While Jackson was losing everything, Keanu Reeves was walking through the streets of Los Angeles. He wasn't at a party. He wasn't giving interviews. He wasn't celebrating. Because to him this had never been about winning. It had been about telling the truth. A journalist had asked him for a statement about Jackson's downfall. Keanu had politely said no. Instead, he walked into a small bookstore, one of the few left in a world of online shopping. The owner, an elderly woman named Lucia, smiled at him. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer," she said. "You sure caused a stir last night, young man." Keanu chuckled. "So I've heard." She placed a newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "The Keanu Effect, Why the World is Rethinking Success." "You didn't just show who Jackson really was," she said. "You reminded people that kindness still matters." Keanu sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That was never my goal." Lucia smiled knowingly. "And that," she said, "is exactly why it worked." Keanu bought a book. Nothing special, just something that caught his eye, then walked back outside, disappearing into the city just like always. Because while the world argued over what had happened, while Jackson's empire crumbled, Keanu Reeves was simply living his life. And that was the biggest difference between them. That night, Leo Jackson sat alone in his penthouse for the last time. By morning it would belong to someone else. His board had wasted no time. His money was being taken away. His power was gone. As he stared at the empty glass in his hand, he finally understood something he had never realized before. Money had never made him powerful. It had only made him think he was powerful. Because real power, the kind that Keanu had, was something money could never buy. Real power was respect. Real power was honesty. And Leo Jackson had spent his whole life chasing something that had never truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.